All right, welcome back. We are COMP397 in the winter 2020 semester. What a winter it is. And it's week 10, part 2 of our broadcast. And what we're talking about now is a little bit of sprite sheet stuff and animation. Let's see where we last left off. So again, if you look online, we have this little plane. We have a high score. But it'd be nice to think about doing some simple animations. Next week, what I want to talk about is more bullets, bullet firing, and all that kind of stuff. This week, though, we're going to start talking about sprite sheets, and then we'll probably end it a little early today, just to get you guys, give you guys some direction, some time to work with your team on your project component, as well as your assignment too. And I'm going to open up the last part of today for questions, okay? And any kind of concerns. If you want to hang out afterwards, I'll be here. All right, so far we've been doing everything with bitmaps, right? So notice that, you know, our game uses this structure where we load everything separately. And we have to do that for these. I mean, this is just our sound stuff. We have all these bitmaps, right? But wouldn't it be nice if we can put some of this or all of this into one big sprite sheet? So number one, we have to ask, you have to ask yourself, what is a sprite sheet? It sounds funny. And what is a sprite anyway, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is, how does CreateGS handle sprites and sprite sheets? So first of all, if we look and see what a sprite sheet is, let's go on the web and just like search for sprite sheets. So if you actually search for that, if I say sprite sheet, just randomly pick one, I can see that sprite sheet is a collection of these little images. Here's Bomberman, this guy right here. That's a very famous one. See if it's not going to give us some weird place. Yay! Bomberman, right? That's a sprite sheet for Bomberman right there. You can see that that's happening. And yeah, so Bomberman, this is interesting. He has a bunch of little states. He has like what looks like jumping and what looks like punching here and running. Almost here's his walk sequence, right? As an example, and some punching on the other side. So he's got a bit of multiple images for one object. That's what it is, right? And what we can do is we can use something called frame-based animation to move from one state to another state. Let's look at another sprite sheet. So that's this one. Let's look at another one. So there's other ones out there. So here's another one. So you can see here you get this little guy. There's another kind of spaceman, right? And on one sheet, looks like, and this is a great example of this, where you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Quite a few little keyframes. That's what they're called. Each of these images are called keyframes, right? And actually, you can start thinking about each of these cycles. I'm sorry, I'm hearing someone come in.
Sorry, we cannot see the screen.
Oh, that's good. Thank you for that. Well, but you can see it on YouTube.
Yeah, that's good.
Hold on a second. Hold on. Thank you. So this is what happens when you're recording.
Yeah.
There we go. And you can see that what I was talking about before. Sprite sheet. Yes. Let's go back to Bomberman. So this was Bomberman. You should be able to see that now. So I was talking about Bomberman. Here's Bomberman, right? Where you have different states. So you can see different images. Thank you for that. And you have a run sequence. You can see that the run sequence happens where there's different. These are all little images are different keyframes. That's what they're called, right? And when we look at another sprite sheet, here's another sprite sheet for this guy. That's what I was looking at. You can see that these are evenly spaced, these little keyframes. And there's a bunch of different images here on one big sheet. That's what this thing is. So what are sprite sheets for? A lot of times they're used for animation. Sometimes, though, they're also used to pack different types of sprites together. So for example, you might have a sheet that's more complex like this, right? Where you have different kinds of sequences in different parts of the sheet. And let me see if I can move this to more of a you know, not the dark version. Let's just refresh that scene. Sorry, moving away from dark. No, that's dark mode. Yes, okay. So you can see that here you have a lot of different things, different elements on the sheet, right? Not just what looks like Iron Man, but let's say other things. You can have other things here. Most of them are something like this, you know, hurt, an attack, a walk sequence, something where they rise or are dead. Like, this is kind of interesting that they did something like this, a zombie sprite sheet. But we can have different states, and what I want to do is use one sheet to kind of navigate through different images. Instead of having, imagine if I had all these images as separate, how would I do that? I would have to have, like, I don't know, probably something more than 20 images here. And I would have to load all that in separately, like this. Imagine 20 for each different kind of character. I have an enemy, 20 of those, or whatever. I have a player, another 20. I have bullets and explosions, another 20, right? That's a lot to load. And it'd be nice if I can load everything at once. Okay, and then just have a texture map, that's what we're going to call it, to access those textures of the sprite sheet. That's what we want to do. That's what we want to do. And so how do we do that? Well, there are some tools to help us. And one of the tools that I like to use is called TexturePacker. So TexturePacker. And I highly recommend, if you're going to buy anything this semester for a tool for 2D, and we didn't really have a book to buy, it's TexturePacker. It's an amazing tool. I've used it for years now. And what it does is it helps us create a sprite sheet, as an example, kind of an all-in-one sprite sheet like this, right? So these sprite sheets down here, it allows us to do that. So it saves us memory because we're only using one sheet. We can compress everything here with TexturePacker. And there's other free tools out there too, but I find that TexturePacker is the best tool. There is a free trial, so you can download TexturePacker for Windows. It's cross-platform. But again, it's the best tool to use. So I'm going to give you this one. It's going to say TexturePacker. I'm going to put this up as a link here inside resources. So make a new link. Highly recommend. Okay, so that's that link. By the way, just for people who are watching remote, under the non-gaming students link under week 10, I've already put up the video for part 1 as well as a link to GitHub if you're just joining now. Okay, there we go. So this is what I want to use, and if I bring it up, so let's bring up TexturePacker. Where's my TexturePacker? Do I not have it installed in this machine? Sorry, this is the thing when you start doing stuff with your machine, you realize how this works. Oh, well, I'll download it right now for us. How about this? I'll show you the download. So, download TexturePacker, right? Here's how it looks. Let's go to downloads. Put it there. I thought I had installed it, but okay, not a big deal. All right, so yes, I install TexturePacker. I accept the agreement. Sure, I'll install it. And we'll install the license later on. So what is this thing that we're downloading and installing? Again, what it allows us to do is a drag and drop interface, right? That allows me to drag and drop images inside of TexturePacker. See what you're seeing here for a second. All right, let's run this thing. TexturePacker. All right, I'm going to agree to it, and I'm going to agree, sure. And it says try TexturePacker Pro or use the free version. That's good. I didn't even know they had a free version. This is new. Or I can enter my license key. I'm not going to enter my license key now. Okay, so I'm going to go just try TexturePacker Pro. Awesome. All right, so this is what it looks like. So on the left, you have some sprites, and on the right, you have different kinds of data formats, right? So if I go to different data formats, I can use If you scroll down, there's one that you're going to see for easel.js, right? So let's see if I can find it. And I passed it. There it is. Here it is, easel.js, CreateGS, right? I want to use that one. Okay. So that's the data format that I'm going to use, easel.js. Okay. And then what I want to do is I want to drag and drop my sprites, my images in here that I want to pack into my sprite sheet. So again, I'm going to go into my project on the desktop, which is 10C, right? And you can see that I have my assets folder. Inside there I have images, and I want to only drop in the images that I'm going to use here. So I know that, you can also look here as an example. I know that I want button and placeholder. So again, I want button and placeholder in there. So button, placeholder, right? I just drag and drop them in here. It's like it makes a list of things I want to put in, right? And what else? I have also start button, next button. Well, next button, I'm not even sure why I'm using next button anymore. I don't really need that. I'm just going to remove this from my loader. I don't need that anymore. Start button, restart button makes sense. So again, start button, restart button. There it is. Start and restart. I know I also have my plane, my cloud, and my island. And I also have my ocean, but I don't recommend loading that. Why? Because this is something I'd probably recommend loading separately. It's a rather big file. It's 640 by 1440. It's not going to help to load this one together, right? You want to load these little small ones together, right? Now I could do this plane, but I have these other planes here, plane 1, plane 2, plane 3. Instead of using this plane, the one that I've been currently using, let's use plane 1, plane 2, plane 3. This is like a little sequence here, right? So let's add that in. Let's also add my bullet. I'm going to do that next week. Might as well add it now this week. So add that in. And so now you see there's a bunch of different images here inside my sprite sheet. So you see how it's packed it in. It's like one sheet to rule them all, right? Now I got to decide on the data file. So you can see on the right hand side here I have data file. I can choose the type of data file that I want and where it's supposed to go. Make sure it's going in the right spot. I'm going to put it on my desktop inside of my project files. And inside my assets, instead of putting it inside images, I'm going to make a new folder in here that I'm going to call sprites. Okay, so this is where it's going to go, in my sprites folder. And I'm going to name this, we're going to call this texture atlas, or just atlas. Because that's what it is. It's almost like I have a bunch of textures together, and it's like an atlas. I'm looking at a map of different things. Okay, so there's two parts. There's the JSON file, which is a data file that I'm going to use to tell me where to look on my texture atlas. So save. So that's the data file. And then we need the texture file, which is going to be called atlas.png. And that should go in the same spot in sprites. So we're going to call this atlas.png, right? There's atlas.png, okay? And then what I can do is, I have some other options here. I have some other options down here. So right now I'm looking at the basic format. I can go to advanced settings in here, and it gives me some additional things. For example, I can trim sprite names. I can prepend the folder name if I want. I can also set up the texture path. I can look at my texture itself. I can change optimization levels. I'm not going to really do that here, right? So for these things. In terms of layout, I've got my maximum size is 2048 by 2048. This is a 2K texture max, right? I can also decide on a fixed size, and from a size constraints perspective, I can choose power of 2, which, by the way, most programs like power of 2. I can also force square, that make it much bigger. I'm not sure that makes any sense for me. For us though, we can also use something called word aligned. Word aligned actually makes this so whatever this is, it's aligned according to the way it works. I can force squared, so this is square sprite sheet. That's what it looks like. You can see that my sprite sheet is 1313 by 13.13. That's the size of it, right? Notice I have a 7-day trial for this thing. Okay. If I went with power of 2, it'd be much bigger. If I went with any size, it'd be 1313 by 1313. That's pretty cool, right? So let's go with word aligned, and I can also say that I want this to be 512 by 512. Usually power of 2 is pretty good, so I can just decide what to do. There's 512 by 512. I can also choose 256. That's going to make it so that one of the sprites doesn't quite make it in. You can see that that size is not big enough for everything I need. Okay. I'm just showing you different features. That's all. Scaling variants. I can scale my sprites if I want to ahead of time, and I can create different scaling variants if I want. My algorithm for compression, I can use max rec. I can also use basic. This is a basic kind of formatting algorithm that aligns everything according to my name. Button, bullet, button, cloud. You see, it's all in order, right? I can sort by name, which is what I want to do. I can sort ascending, and I can pack best, which is going to pack the best way it's possible. Okay? I can detect identical sprites if I want. My trim mode, I can add margins in here as well. So I can say, like, how much space do I want between these two things? So right now there is a trim margin of 1 and a transparency threshold of 1. I can extrude, I can add border padding around the sprites. So if I increase this number, you can see I can make, there's padding. I can also, I'm not going to do this, but I'm showing you that you can. I can also do shape padding within the shapes themselves. You can see those things. See? Each individual one. I don't want that. I want a 0. I want 0 for this. Okay? If that makes sense. And I can increase the trim margin if I want. Okay, trim margin. I can go to 0 or 1. And same thing with everything else. So I can trim, or I can say none. And I can just say, I don't want any trimming at all. It's going to be exactly where it's going to be. That's fine for me. I'm totally fine with none, right? From a trim mode perspective, I don't want to trim it. Again, now it's 351 by 351. That is the size of my object. And because I packed it with the basic algorithm by name. Cool. So I've got exactly what I want for my sprite sheet. I've got all the things I want in here. I can even check to see what the animation is going to look like. If I highlight 3 of the sprites, which is my plane, I can actually preview the animation. And you can see that, I know it's kind of hard to see this, but the propellers are actually moving in here, if you can actually look closer. I can increase the speed, right, so that they look like they're moving faster, right? Or I can go really, really slow, and I can check out that propeller speed. That's the only thing that's changing on the plane, guys. That's the animation, the little propellers that are right here. It's hard to see. But they're actually visible if you look at the screen or if you try it yourself. So that's what, it just checks out the animation and see what it looks like. Okay, cool. Now, I can press the publish sprite sheet. Publish. Now, I'm not sure if it'll allow me to do that because I'm using the I'm testing the pro feature. So if I publish it, it writes it. Okay. Cool. And now let's take a look and see what we've got. So we're going to move towards the assets into sprites. And it's created 2 things, an atlas.json file and an atlas.png. I can see these 2 things inside of my project files as well. Let's take a look. So my assets inside sprites, I can see an atlas.json, this thing, as well as a atlas.png, which is this thing. It's the entire PNG file that I just created here with my tool. Okay. So what does this, how does this work, right? I mean, sure, I created these 2 things, but who cares, right? Well, I want to have one sheet instead of having multiple sheets, instead of having multiple files. So my atlas, what it does is this. It says, okay, here's my atlas.json. It's going to look for a particular file, atlas.png. I can set the frame rate of all my sprites if I want to, and then it creates frames. Frame 1, frame 0, 1, 2. It creates almost like an array of information. Okay, so what does it have here? Here's my x, here's my y, here's my width, here's my height. That's the first thing it does. So the first part is x, y, width, and height. And then there's some extra additional features which we don't need right now. Okay, registration, you can actually center things or not. And notice what it does. So once we have our frames, these are all the frames in my sprite sheet, right? Remember we talked about keyframes? Each keyframe is an image on the sprite sheet. And then we have this, animations. Here's my bullet, it uses frame 0. My button is frames 1. So it looks at frames 1. My cloud is frames 2. 0, 1, 2. And how do you know this is true? X is 1, Y is 53. This is the X and Y on the actual sheet itself. This is where to find stuff. And then how wide is this image? 226 by 178. That's what these things do. And it kind of puts them all in alphabetical order. Okay. Then we have this little thing here for TexturePacker. We don't need this part. I can remove it. We're going to modify this thing for a second, and we're going to import this inside of our game.ts file. Okay. Are you with me? Are you guys with me? So hopefully you're following along, right? And you've downloaded TexturePacker like me, right? Okay, a couple things we don't need. We don't need frame rate. We can get rid of this for a second. So frame rate can go away. Okay. Atlas.png is okay. This is pretty cool. And we're going to realign this. I don't need plane 1, plane 2, plane 3. I don't need this. I need plane 1, or just call, one of us going to call it plane. And we know it's frames 5, 6, and 7. That's the animation, right? So we're going to get rid of plane 2 and plane 3. And we can say that the plane has 3 frames of animation. Frame 5, frame 6, and frame 7. That means 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. You can see that these 3 are the plane. A good way to know this is the size, width, and height are 65 each. And then the location, 68, 233, and so on. Notice that the island is number 3, and the placeholder is number 4. The island and the placeholder, actually the placeholder is the exact size of the plane. That's how we made it. And that's why it's positioned where it is. Okay. To make sure that this makes sense, you can check it. If you go to the atlas.png, you can see that the placeholder's first, right? Placeholder is at frame number 4, right? So again, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1, X is 1, Y is 233 pixels. X is 1 on the corner. Y is 233 pixels down here, right? That's the beginning of it. 65 width, 65 height, right? So 65 and 1 would be 66, theoretically, right? So this should start around 66 plus some padding. That's the next one starts at 68. This is the next place that is put into place. 68 and 233. Then the next one, and then the next one. So these 3 frames here are all the plane frames. This represents the plane's animation right here. And that's why I've put them all together. Okay? So that's really the sheet. Now let's take a look at what CreateGS needs. This is what TexturePacker created for us, but what does CreateGS need? So I'm going to go back to easel.js documentation. Okay. And if you look on the easel.js docs, if I want to look at Sprite, so if I look at SpriteSheet, SpriteSheet class kind of looks like this. I'm going to bring this a little bit bigger for you guys to see. We need some kind of image. We need some kind of frames, right? And what you can do is you can pack it like this, like how it's been done for us, right? Packed. And we can talk about animations. The name of the animation followed by the frame number. And a good example of that is the run animation, the run sequence. You can see that I have 2 frames for this. I can also specify a number of speed. So I can do this. I can say my run animation has these frames, or my shoot animation has these frames. I can go to the next one and I have a speed. The speed indicates how fast this thing runs. Every 60 seconds. How fast? How many times do I repeat it every 60 seconds? And I can modify the speed of my animation. Okay, so that's kind of a description of how we create, how we access the Sprite Sheet. And then what we need to do is we need to create the Sprite Sheet. So Sprite Sheet looks like this. So first we have our data. This is our data, which we're going to get in a second. And then we need to have a Sprite Sheet. We can create a new CreateGS Sprite Sheet and pass in a reference to the data in here, right? And when I want to use the data, I can just simply go to whatever the object is. It has to be a sprite. It cannot be a bitmap anymore. And then I can just call the Sprite Sheet, whatever the Sprite Sheet is, and then run. And what run is, in this case run, refers to the run animation, this part right here. If I was going to run the plane, then on my thing I would call plane, and plane would run these 3 frames of animation. Okay? So this is how it looks. It's like, hey, CreateGS.sprite. I want to use this Sprite Sheet, and I want to use this animation, and I want to store the sprite that comes out of this thing inside this animation variable. That's how it works. And notice it even references TexturePacker right here. It's just so super easy to make use of it. Could you do this on your own? Could you make a Sprite Sheet on your own? Absolutely. But you'd have to go through and make sure you position on with some graphic manipulation program where you want each of the sprites to be. Okay, and then from there you have to create this structure so that CreateGS understands what you want to load. A lot of work, and you don't have to do all that by yourself. We have TexturePacker. Questions around this? Okay, you guys are good to go, it looks like. No? You're not good to go? You are good to go. All right. Yes, good. All right, excellent. So, so wonderful. So we want to make use of this thing. This is the structure we want to use, and we have it here. We have the structure here. So for now, what we're going to do is in my game.ts, we have our asset manifests. We want to have our, Atlas data, right? That's what we want to have. We're just going to call it data for now. So we're going to call this sprite data, right? So a new object. And we're going to copy this stuff that's inside of our atlas.json, which is all of this, all the way here. I'm going to copy. I'm going to keep this file as a reference. We're not going to mess this up because we can always go back and fix it if we mess something up, right? And then go here and paste. So now it's actually in our game, this thing, all right? A couple things to note. That my images, it has to point to the right thing. Atlas.png, this doesn't work, right? Because remember, my images right now, what it does is it points to something that doesn't exist. There is no atlas.png. You have to go into assets, sprites, atlas.png. I could put that here, but that means I wouldn't be preloading. And that's a pretty big sheet to preload. So instead, I can preload my sheet here and then reference it later down here. Okay, so one thing to note is I have an images folder, right? And what I can simply do is I can make it so that the images is a is an array of images. But in this case, instead of me giving it something, I can give it nothing. That's totally legal to do, right? So images is just an array of empty objects, right? That's what I can do. We know that I want to preload, so I can preload the image. Let's go to, I'm going to keep all this for now, you'll see. I'm going to preload, I'm going to go to just copy paste the cloud. And instead of that, I want to call this the Atlas. All right, and the Atlas is going to go into assets, sprites, and then atlas.png. That loads up the Atlas. That's what it does. This gives me directions on how to use the Atlas. We need to modify one, which is this one. The plain sprite is slightly different than all the other ones, right? The plain sprite, this one, well, it has a couple of additional pieces of information. Just like we saw inside this, we need to give it frames and speed. So we have frames, but we don't have speed. Let's add speed in there as well. We can manually do that. So speed. And we can say 0.5 is the answer to that. So that's for the plane. For now, 0.5 may not be the right value. We have to check that and see if it's the right value. The rest are okay. The rest are perfectly fine. So when we preload, we're going to go and preload our assets. That's up here. This is all the same stuff. The asset manifest is still going to work, right? Except this sprite data is going to contain information for us about our sprite sheet that we haven't loaded yet. We're going to wait to load it, and then we're going to create the sprite sheet. Okay? So up here, I want to make a new construct called the texture atlas. So let texture atlas be of type CreateGS.SpriteSheet. Okay, that's what this is. Okay, so that's a sprite sheet, a new construct. And then we're going to load everything as normal in the preloader, but in the start method, after the preloading is done, it's going to call start. And here is where I'm going to start to load my stuff. So before I change scenes, I'm going to say that the texture atlas is equal to a new CreateJS.SpriteSheet, right? And I'm going to pass in the data texture, which is, sorry, the sprite data. But the sprite data will look at the wrong thing because sprite data looks at nothing for images, but we know we want to load the atlas, and we can do that by saying something like sprite data dot images is equal to, and I'm just going to inject that. I'm going to say that it is assets dot get result. I'm going to pass in a reference to the atlas that's in here. Now the problem is that says, wait a minute, it says type object is not assignable to type string. Well, because up here we indicated that it would be a string, but we don't have to, right? We can literally just make it whatever we want. It doesn't matter, right? And now it won't complain. So we're going to make it this, which is going to be a reference to the images. That's going to fix this up. Then we're going to pass sprite sheet. Notice it just does this, right? We're going to pass this into my sprite data and then as a sprite sheet. And once we have this, my friends, then we have everything we need to start using my sprite sheet. Okay, so let's test it. Let's see if it doesn't stop running for some reason. And we'll go into our data and see if it works. So again, I'm going to be up here. And if I refresh this, we're still good to go. Right? If I click start, you can see everything still runs. Right? And this is good. This is the first step. Again, if I refresh, you can see that there's a moment of loading, and then we get into this. Now, we're not using it yet. I'm just trying to make sure that this all works first before we start using it. Because major changes have to happen in order for us to start using the sprite sheet. Major changes. Why? Because our game object superclass right now, if you look at our game object, our game object is a bitmap. And my friends, bitmaps, yeah, they don't work with sprites. Sprites are sprites. They're not bitmaps, right? So I have to change the nature of how we do stuff, right? A little bit. In order for all of our game objects to be sprites. Let's take a look at which ones use it before I make the change. So here's our button. Button is a game object. Cloud. Cloud is a game object. How about ocean? Ocean is a game object. Uh-oh. But we never used ocean, right? We used the ocean itself. We're not going to make ocean a sprite because it's too big, right? We're not going to do that kind of thing typically. We don't use a sprite that's large. And if anything, we use a sprite map for a big ocean. We break the ocean up into different pieces, a tileable texture, if you will, right, that we can use later on. That's the ocean. But we don't do the ocean in this one big sprite. It's almost like we need another superclass, something that inherits from, this one, or another, kind of object. Instead of a game object, we need something that uses a sprite. Okay? Are you with me so far? I'm just checking. Hopefully you guys are okay. Yes, good. So you can see that, so this is our challenge. Our challenge is, how do I convert everything that we have here from a game object to a game object that takes a sprite? Okay, that's a problem. But it's only a problem for my, it's not a problem for my plane, right? Plane, that works, that makes sense, right? It's not a problem for my player. My scene, right? My scene is uses a container, and my vector, well, that's its own thing, right? So the only conflict that I have really is my ocean, right? That's the only conflict that I have. So it's almost like I want to create two game objects. There's going to be one type of game object that is a sprite type, and there's another type of game object that is not a sprite. Okay? So again, we have some different options for us to use. I could say, a sprite game object, or a bitmap game object, whatever I want. I could say, an animated game object, as an example. And it makes sense for buttons, because I can have different states for buttons. When I hover over a button, I can switch from one state to the other state. That makes sense for buttons. Bullets, same thing. I can make a bullet that kind of grows and shrinks. I can do all kinds of little things for bullets and whatever. And so it makes sense for bullets too. And for my enemies. But it doesn't make sense for my ocean. So that is the only thing that we have to change, the ocean part. So we have some decisions to make. So because game object is a bitmap, then we have to make sure that things that are here, we want to inherit, right? We want to inherit from game object. And I have everything that these things that I have so far would work. All this would work normally, as an example, right? With whether it's a sprite or a bitmap. This is nothing to do with my sprite or bitmap. This is my own creation, right? Our own stuff that we have. So this doesn't change, right? What changes is when we actually use stuff that's part of the bitmap class. So when I say X and Y, well, that's a bitmap, right? That's different about a bitmap, right? We know that X and Y is also something that not just bitmaps have, but also display objects. So let me go back to that. So if I go back to my documentation, right, and if I go to bitmap for a second, you can see that bitmap is of type a display object. And what about sprite? Well, guess what? Sprite is a type of display object as well, right? Both bitmap and sprite are a type of display object. Wouldn't it be interesting then if I can somehow make a superclass that is of type display object, and then my subclass will be of type sprite? I could probably do something like that, right? Where, one is the kind of superclass of the other one. Or I can just simply make two. One game object that's a regular one, and another one that's like an animated game object, or a sprite game object, however you want to do it. So for me, to keep it simple, right, because think about this. If I make this a display object type, and then the next one is going to be a bitmap type. Bitmap already extends display objects. It doesn't make any sense. So instead of doing this, I'm just going to make two of these. But we don't want to duplicate some of this stuff, because all this stuff is pretty much going to be the same for everything that we have. It's like ocean and our animated game object is going to be the exact same thing, There is no difference between one and the other, like literally no difference. So what I could do is I can make a subclass. My challenge is that because my game object superclass is a game object, is a bitmap, then this is where I'm going to have a problem, right? Because I can't extend, bitmap and make it into another object. You can't do that. You can't say, well, now bitmap's not a bitmap, it's a sprite. You can't do that. So any other suggestions? Do you guys have suggestions of what to do? I'm just looking at the thing here. Anybody? And that's okay if you don't, because this is where we have to make decisions. So going back, one decision is make the ocean a sprite, but not on, it doesn't have to be, on the sprite sheet. Why? Because if you look, what we can also do for the ocean is it can be its own sprite, right? So notice that for the sprite class, it says the instance, we have a new sprite that is coming from the sprite sheet, right? And we can go to and stop on whatever the frame name is called. That's definitely one way of doing it. So the sprite sheet, okay? And if I go to my sprite sheet class, you can see that you can specify, information about the sprite sheet ahead of time. You can sit there and go, I want to, have my sprite sheet. It has this information. I can make just the data just enough, a separate sprite sheet just for my ocean, as an example, even though it's not really a sprite, it's not a bitmap anymore, but I don't have to load it in. And you can see that there's only one image, right? Ocean. My frame, there's only one frame. I have to create this frame myself. So if you notice, there's only one frame with a width and a height of whatever it's going to be. I only have one animation, which is the ocean animation, right, as an example, and it's a separate sprite altogether. Okay, so I could do that, the ocean sprite. Okay, and I think that might be the easiest thing for me to do. Okay, so what I mean by that is, first let's prepare, and this is part of what we normally do. So I have this is our sprite data. Let's take a look at our ocean data. So we'll call this let ocean data equal to, and this is an approach. Doesn't mean that this is the only way you can do things. I'm definitely going to have images, so I'm going to drop this in there, right? Because I'm showing you how to construct it by hand too. Frames, so I'll grab all this. But instead of me having multiple frames, there's only going to be one, right? There's my frame. And now, okay, where does it start? It starts at 0, 0, because that's where the ocean is, top left corner. And what's the width of the ocean? Well, that's 640. What's the height of the ocean? Well, that's 1440, because we know that it's 3 screens high. So 3 screens high, if I use my calculator, if I do 480 times 3, you can see it's 1440, right? So that's width and height. So that's the frames, images, frames, and some information, right? And then finally animations. Let's just grab this animations. I'm just going to grab the first one and close it. So it's the next part. Animations, I'll close it. There it is. We're going to call this the ocean animation, right? For ocean data. Frames is 0. This is the first frame. This is the first frame of the animation. And guys, that's it. We just described our ocean. We don't have to make something new. It's here, right? We just have our own ocean data. Now, what this means is we need a separate sprite just for this. So in order for me to do that, then just like we have here for our texture atlas and our sprite, we need to have another thing. So we're going to say that ocean data dot images is equal to assets dot get results, and then we're going to look at the ocean. We already loaded that up, right, for ourselves. And then we'll say that the new thing, which is the ocean itself, the ocean atlas, this is called ocean atlas for now. It's only one ocean. but just to be the same, right? It's less work. There's my Ocean Atlas. And in my Ocean Atlas, I'm going to say that Ocean Atlas is equal to a new CreateGS.SpriteSheet, where we pass in the ocean. Sorry. Yep. We pass in the ocean. Nice that they're showing us the mobility bill. Yay! Hey, customer, your ability bill. And there it is. So there's the data, ocean data. So I have Sprite data and ocean data. It looks pretty good. We have a very small amount of data here, right? And we have larger data everywhere else, right? Let's see if this works. Let's see if it still runs. This is the first part. We just modify stuff and then we see if it runs still. If there's anything broken, we want to catch it now. So again, going back, let's see if this thing runs and we're still good to go, right? Again, we're not using anything yet, but that's the first step. Does it still run? Excellent. So we know it's running till now. Now, the changes. I'm going to go into my GameObject superclass. And now I can make everything a sprite, because even though Ocean isn't part of the same sprite sheet, it's still a sprite. So we can say that this creates a different scenario. CreateGS.Sprite. Okay. I'm going to have issues. Why? Because I'm not giving Sprite what it needs. Sprite needs two pieces of data now. Okay? Two pieces of data. It needs the name of my object, right? Which is whatever this is called, right? First. And I've used a triple constructor for this, so I've got to be really careful. And I need to know my sprite sheet, whatever it's going to be, okay? But I'm inside of a game object, and game object has no knowledge of any sprite sheet. So now we come back to the config. This is why the config is so important for us, right? Again, multiple ways of doing this. You could pass it by reference. You can do all kinds of stuff. I just find this little thing a little bit easier, okay? So again, we need two, public static. And we can call this the texture atlas, right? Which is of type, remember what this is. It's a CreateGS.SpriteSheet. That's what it is, okay? And then we also need the other one, static, which is the Ocean Atlas. We only have one. And it's kind of like this is kind of a brute force approach. But at least it gives us this information. So here's our sprite sheet. Okay, pretty cool, right? So I have two. I have a texture atlas for my, for one, and my ocean atlas for the other one. So what I want to do now, notice that now it's broken. You can see immediately it's broken. Why? Because I've gone and changed my game object to a sprite, and it doesn't know what to do with this information. So two things. Instead of me passing in my first, instead of it being just an image string, which is an object, we want to pass in all the time, right? Two parts, two pieces of information. The pieces it needs is a sprite sheet followed by a frame or animation. That's what we need. Sprite sheet followed by frame or animation. So I want to pass in the name of the sprite sheet that goes to here, whatever that sprite sheet happens to be, right? And notice that no matter what we do, we're still going to have the first thing. We can make it be a sprite sheet. We can do this, right? Because we have to figure this out now. So that's the first thing. So the image string is actually the name of my object, right? The name of my object. So it can take an image string, right? It can also take an object of type getResult, right? The second is a vector, that's what it said, or a number, right? Vector or a number. The third is a Boolean or a number, and the fourth is a Boolean. So we're giving it a couple of options. One that takes an object, an X and Y coordinate, and one that takes an object and position, a position vector. That's the only thing we've done here, right? So first is always the object that we pass in. Well, now instead of it being an object, we're going to specify what this is, right? We're going to say that this is a CreateGS.SpriteSheet. That's the first part. What's the sprite sheet that I'm using, right? And the same thing goes here. CreateGS.SpriteSheet. So that's the first part. So first comes in, it's of type CreateGS.SpriteSheet. We're not going to pass in a placeholder anymore, right? So this is not going to fly because it's not going to work. So this is a CreateGS.SpriteSheet. Always. Yeah? And that's going to work there. But now we need the friendly name for that sprite sheet. Instead of it being an image string, the first thing is going to be the sprite sheet. Sprite sheet. Actually, we should probably name it properly. Sprite sheet. Like this. That's the first position. Okay, so the first one's the sprite sheet. The second thing, always, not second, right? The second thing must be the sprite sheet's name, or the frame name, if you will. So that's the second thing we need in the constructor. So we need a frame. So we'll say that frame name, right, which is going to be of type string. Okay, we'll do the same thing for this one. So frame name, which is of type string. Cool? So the second one is always going to be a frame name of type string. So we're going to say that the frame name of type string, we can set the defaults to something like placeholder. We can do that. Now you got to be careful because when we do this, we mess things up. Let's not do that here actually. Let's do it at the bottom. Then we can make it optional. So the second, which will be this one, second, is actually, we have to rejig some of this stuff and be patient with me while I do this. Okay, so second is a string. And the third, this is the third. And this is the fourth. And now there's 5. There's up to 5 parameters. Okay. Now it says a required parameter cannot follow an optional parameter, right? Well, this one. Yeah, so this one will have to be optional as well. That's also a thing. Optional, because this part right here, we can say that this is also maybe a thing called placeholder. And to test this out, right, if I go to game.ts, not this game.ts, but this one, we can see that placeholder is a thing. Placeholder, right? Okay, so there's placeholder. So then that's optional. Now where we have problems is that first goes here and second goes there. That is the frame or animation name. First and second this time. So again, we're just converting this from a bitmap to a sprite with all its requirements. I'm adding in frame name, which is the second option, and then I'm replacing second with third and third with fourth and fourth with fifth. So going back down here, we can say that this is fifth. If fifth is undefined, then this dot centered is equal to fifth. Third would be fourth. We're just moving this on. If fourth is a Boolean, then it's equal to fourth. Right? These are changes. Second is not ever going to be a number. It's going to be third. Anytime it says second, we're just going to change this to third. And if type of fourth is also a number, so third and fourth, this is third, this is fourth. And if third, this is third. If third instance of vector, then that's equal to third. So all I've done is I've just moved the parameters down a little bit. That's all I've done. By 1. So I made, because remember we made a new second. So first and second. And then third was renamed from second, and fourth was from third, and fifth was from fourth, and so on. So all I've done is rename some of these parameters in the bottom. Now it should work. Okay? So this is the superclass. We pass in 2 things now. The sprite sheet and the name. Okay, cool. So this solidifies my game object. And what I want to do now is modify the ones that use it. You can see I have all kinds of issues now, right? Let's go to my plane. So my plane says, hey, let's do config assets get result. I don't have to do this anymore. I have to pass in the name of my sprite sheet. Remember, that's the first parameter. Config.game. Again, it's the texture atlas for this one. And then the name of the plane, which is plane. That's the one I want. That's for my plane. That's the new way of doing things. Okay? So that's plane. Next, let's fix the next one. Ocean. Ocean's different. Ocean's different. Ocean looks like this. Config.game.ocean atlas and then ocean. Okay, that's ocean. That's fixed. Cool. Label is needed. Island. Island. Okay. Config.game.textureAtlas and then island, right? Okay. Cloud. Let's just copy this. I'm not going to, copy paste this one in here. Cloud. And cloud. Button. Constructor. See this image path stuff? Button. And why is it not good? Oh. Wait. So it uses button. I see what you've done here. So here's my image path. So button is slightly different. I'm going to come back to button in a second. What about player? What does player do? Player is extends game object and doesn't do anything. That's okay. That's an option. So plane is done. Okay, so button is the only one that's outstanding. So let's talk about button a little bit. So the way button used to work is all it needed was a name as an option. If you gave it a name, button, whatever that is, right, then I would take that image path and that's what it would use for the rest. So if I go to references for the button, let's take a look at our start button. It's under scenes. When I make a start button, start.ts, I do instantiate a new button, and I say, well, let's pass in the reference to the button. That's what I'm doing here. So I have to change all my buttons to kind of be a little different than this, right? Where I'm putting the reference into the button here, and that doesn't make any sense. All I want to do is pass in a friendly name for the button, like start button, which makes more sense, right? And start button is going to be picked up from the object itself. So I'm only passing in a string from now on, right? Again, if I go back to my game object button, then what I want is now for my image path to be just a button name. So we'll rename this thing to button name. We'll make this into a string, which by default is going to be button. That's what it's going to take. So button now isn't going to take everything, just this. And whatever the button name is, I'm going to pass that into config.game.textureAtlas and then my button name. And that's going to be the way we're going to fix it. See? So button name, by default it's button, but otherwise you can pass in something, whatever the button's called, and it's going to come in here and work. Whew. Crazy changes, right? Still not done. And let's fix the other buttons because there's more buttons I've used. I've used two buttons. I've got one in the start scene and one in the end scene. So let's fix that end scene button. So you can see that there's a problem in there. Why? Because the end scene does kind of what I did before, which is this. Which is, you know what, that's just the way we made our button last time. And I think it's just better the way we're making it now. Where we just say, hey, it's the restart button I want. or whatever it's called, right? And it's going to make it whatever we make. Okay, so those rings are done. But now we have one more thing to change, and that's inside of the game.ts. So you can see game.ts here. Here it is. And if I scroll all the way down, we've made our texture atlas, we've made our ocean atlas, and we've even made a config, but we never referenced it. Now we have to reference it. So we have to say that config.game.textureatlas is equal to texture atlas. So a reference, we're making a reference to this texture atlas here on the global config, and the same thing goes for the ocean atlas. Config.game.oceanatlas is equal to the ocean atlas. And guys, this is with absolutely no testing. So I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know nothing. Let's see if it works. And we can see that it's good. Guys, this is working with the sprite sheet now. This is a sprite from now on. And if I click start, you can see that the propellers are working too. Look, take a look at those propellers, guys. We have animations. Awesome. All the same stuff is functional, and we did this by we did a procedure doctors. That's what we did. We transplanted from one patient the heart into the other patient. That's what we did just now. And we made it work with sprites. Okay, so now some cleanup. Right, so to finish this off, we're going to clean it up. So I'm going to go to my game.ts, and on the top we have all this stuff here we don't need. Guess what we don't need? All of this. We need the ocean, that we need, but we don't need this, and we don't need plane, island, cloud. We don't need this, right? We only need this, an ocean and an atlas. That's all we need now, because everything else is inside two sprite sheets. My ocean sprite sheet, which is inside my ocean.gif file, and my atlas. And one we made automatically with TexturePacker, and the other one we made by hand. Okay, which is how we could define an ocean. And like I said, you don't need TexturePacker. If you know how to put things together just like I showed you, you can make your own sprite sheet. Although, I'll be honest, TexturePacker certainly helps to do all this for you. Okay? Let's see if it still works. So did I mess up? Nope. Looks like we're still good, right? And we got a lean and mean program now that uses a sprite, right, for its animation. And that plane is actually animated. It's hard to see because it's so small, but actually it is animated. And this is the beginning of all of our animations that we're going to start. This is why it's called Intro to Animation, right? Because we're going to do next week. We're actually going to do more complex animations with explosions. Okay, so pretty cool. Questions around this before we put it up on GitHub. So lots of stuff. Like guys, it's much more complex than you may have seen before. Okay. I'm seeing no questions. Okay. Well, I appreciate your attention anyway. Let's do a couple things here. Let's put this up on GitHub. There's lots of changes. You can see there's a ton of changes. All these things had to change. And we're going to stage all these changes here. I'm going to say converted game object to sprite. That's what all these changes are about. All this. And then we're going to commit and push. And that should push everything up on GitHub, which ends off our discussion about sprite sheets for today. Okay? And that's our new reality now. Our new reality is this, where we don't have a... Now notice I can't put this into the sprite sheet. These are sounds. By the way, there is something called a sound sprite sheet. Sound sprites. There does exist. More complex to use, but they do exist where you can put like one sound file can hold many different sounds, and you can access those different sounds in different places. For now, we're not going to do that. Okay? But it is there. Okay. And I'm just going to collapse all this. We're good to go. Save everything. And we're going to just go back to our screen here. All right. So that is it for today. Anybody have any questions for me before I move on? No questions. Awesome. All right. So couple things to note. Again, just to reiterate. So next week, you have the one thing that's due is your beta release for your team. It's due next week at midnight. Like we said, I'll put up another little announcement that says, hey, by the way, guys, here are the course changes. The only thing that changes is these 2 dates for your assignment 2. It's going to be pushed off. And your beta, that's going to be pushed off till next week, not this week. Those are the 2 things that are changing so far. And that's for the most part what it is. And this week we covered SpriteSheets, which is something that I wanted to start off with. We're going to do more of this. So I recommend, if you haven't had a chance, to download TexturePacker, because we're going to do more of this TexturePacker stuff. One thing to note before we go is also you can save the TexturePacker project. So I can say File. I can save the project, right? It's going to ask me where I want to save it. I can save the project inside of my desktop, inside of my project files. So I can go into 10C. And I can save it inside my assets sprites. We're going to call this the TexturePacker project. So we'll say TP project, right? TPS. And why? Because then I can go in here and modify this later on, and I don't have to do all this again, right? If I want to set up another Sprite Sheet. Let me close this down. And now there is yet another change because we added that in. So TexturePacker project. So I can say, we'll stage that change and added TexturePacker project. So you guys can play with that for yourselves. If you download my project files, you can do the same thing I just did. You can try it out for yourself. Okay. Other than that, guys, I have nothing else to add. If anyone wants to stay around, I'm going to stick around for the next 10 minutes. But for the rest of you guys, I'll see you guys next week. Thank you so much for being flexible. I know this is a challenging time. We're going to work through this together. Don't worry about it. From a Mark's perspective, I'm going to be lenient. Just make sure you get everything in. And if you haven't had a chance to get something in, let me know. We can work something out where it's going to be a little bit easier for you to kind of handle. Okay, so please let me know. I want to help. I'm here to help you out. I know this is not a regular semester, so we'll work on it together. But if no one else has anything else, I'm going to stop recording now, and then you can come on for questions after. So that's what I'm going to do right now. All right, let's do this. Let's stop recording.